Hello and welcome to the first in a new series of interviews exclusively for PV Tech Premium subscribers, where we speak to some of the solar industry's leading figures on its most pressing issues. Joining me today is Vassilis Papaeconomou, who's Managing Director at renewable service provider Alectris. Vassilis, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks very much, Liam, for this interview and the time you're giving me to speak about our industry. I really appreciate that. And I hope this is going to be a very interesting discussion today.
I'm sure it will be. I think without kind of any further ado, let's get straight into the discussion then. I know, kind of having spoken to you about this before and kind of reflecting on some of the most recent reports that we've seen on the industry's growth from the likes of Bloomberg NEF and the International Energy Agency, they've really kind of highlighted the potential of and the need for global solar markets to grow quite rapidly. What's your kind of take on solar's growth strategy to date and indeed moving forward?
Well, indeed, what we see in the last years actually is our industry really picking up quite intensively. And by our industry, I mean whole renewables, but more specifically solar PV industry. And it's not a localized industry anymore. I think we all know that. So it's not specific countries that show a momentum. We see that just developing on a global scale, which is very encouraging. And I think at the end, it really coincides very well with the COVID crisis. So most of the states, most of the countries, we're going to be expecting some sort of financial crisis after that. And I think the development of the solar industry investment in renewables is going to help mitigate that risk for all the countries at the end of the day.
And I think one of the things that I've really taken, especially amidst the kind of crisis that we've seen in kind of polysilicon and other materials, is and indeed that how it's reflected on module prices in certainly the last 6 months or so. There is this real continued focus on the reduction of component costs and how they can really drive solar installations from that kind of tens of gigawatts figure into the hundreds of gigawatts figures per year that we're going to need to hit by the end of the decade. Obviously, components have come down in cost quite significantly over the last 10 years, but there is also that need for these costs to bleed into other costs associated with solar deployment, be they soft costs or even the kind of the cost of operations and asset management. How do you feel from your position at Alectris that those cost reductions can be achieved?
Well, indeed, components pricing has dropped down quite significantly. I think we're slowly reaching a point that it's not going to drop further, at least not at that pace. But further cost reduction is needed, both OPEX and CAPEX. I think the focus as a next step would be the OPEX cost reduction. And there's where the whole idea of reducing soft costs actually fits in. And we're talking about asset management, operations, and maintenance. These prices have been dropping as well, but I don't think we've reached the optimum of that yet, because I think this is the toughest part, in a sense that the so-called soft costs, I believe that's what you're referring to. There is an industry-wide misperception of that. So people are trying to reduce the cost, but at the first instance, they're trying to reduce the scope, to optimize the scope, which makes sense, but there are limitations to that, because if you reduce the scope too much, then you lose actually on the long-term perspective. So, for example, if you do less maintenance, it sounds more attractive because you pay a lower cost for the maintenance. But if these assets are there to produce electricity for the next decades, that's going to fire back sooner or later. I have the feeling that the industry has been focusing too much on reducing and optimizing the scope, and the overall operations idea, the soft costs, the way I define them at least, are not really in focus right now. And to tell you a simple example, you can still do the same scope of work as an O&M contractor, talking about our business, but reduce your costs, where, for example, a very high percentage of this cost of the time spent is preparing reports, communicating, standardizing operations. I'm not saying we should not do that, but I think we should find really smart ways to do that better, sort of integrate teams, standardize processes between the various stakeholders. And what I experience in our business, for example, there is a lot of time that is wasted on back and forth communications. Although we're talking a lot about digitalization in our industry and the IT technology already exists, I think to a very large extent in the solar industry, we are not actually using this technology to their full extent. So there's a lot of companies, and companies meaning asset managers, O&M contractors, asset owners, that are really relying on spreadsheets and emailing as a means of information exchange. And we have not really invested that much in standardization of processes, IT in a smart way, and to minimize these wasted time in communications, preparing reports, verifying reports, and stuff like that. It's very hard to describe that, but there is enormous amounts of time lost, and these are really non-productive amounts of time. So you have a senior engineer, very experienced with 10, 15 years in the solar industry. Basically, a high percentage of his job is just conveying email messages back and forth. So this is a complete waste of resources, and we should focus on using these resources in what they're good at, meaning their experience, their technical competence, and less in just day-to-day simple communications. And that can be achieved with, if we manage as an industry to standardize our processes, I think there's going to be a significantly lower workload in useless communications where someone sends an email, he gets a reply, what do you mean by that? And there's another reply, and then there is, this back and forth, which can take hours. And I've seen that in our team, and it's really a pity to see that still happening. I have to say though that I believe that this lack of standardization is more a thing that we see in the solar industry, not in the renewables, generally speaking. Wind, for example, has achieved much more, but it's another kind of industry, much older in large scale, I would say, than solar. But I think this is a process that every industry has to go through. It's the maturization process. So we are talking, that's a good sign. We are talking about standardization. We are talking about digitalization. But I have a strong feeling that these are, at least at the current stage, more buzzwords than people have really understood what this is. So standardization and digitalization is not just buying a piece of software and then everything works. You need to have a management decision, management direction towards standardization, because this involves basically the whole team changing internal processes. So there's a lot of things that need to be done before you can efficiently use a digital tool. So it's not just acquiring software that's going to make the difference, but the mentality and the mindset that people do understand what the cost savings can result out of that. And the first thing that they need to do is address the inefficiencies in their processes, and these need to be reflected in an IT tool. So that it's an IT tool. It's not like the software is going to make the difference. It's going to help you make the difference, but it's a purely management decision inside a company and an overall concept that the industry needs to adopt. Because at the end of the day, we want the different stakeholders, asset managers, O&M contractors, asset owners to collaborate efficiently.
Sure. Sure. So when it comes to that kind of digitalization, like you speak of, I think at times there's the industry is quite common or quite prone to lumping them in with other kind of buzzwords, like you say, whether it's artificial intelligence or machine learning. And there's an easy misconception to misunderstand or misinterpret what those solutions are and what they can contribute. How do you feel they should work or be approached or adopted into solar operations, and what do asset owners or operators need to be aware or cautious of when approaching them?
Well, there's quite a few buzzwords out there. I mean, AI is one of them. Artificial intelligence, big data. Until recently, I haven't heard these buzzwords for a long time. You know, I do not know even the definitions of them exactly to be able to answer precisely. But what really matters is, one thing that the most stakeholders are missing is not about the big data kind of a thing. It's not about the massive data that needs to be analyzed. The data in our industry is not that massive, I believe. So it's quite limited compared to the data that a company like Google would collect. So I think big data is a nice thing to talk about, but I'm not sure about the relevance in our industry. So the point that I think needs to be addressed is not about analyzing the data only. I mean, that's definitely something of added value. But in my opinion, it's more about processes and standardization of processes. And this is very closely connected to software. It's not, you cannot standardize the processes without a software tool, without an ERP, for example. Especially since what we discussed in the very beginning of this discussion, the market is becoming more and more global. So if you want to standardize things, imagine how difficult this task is to do on paper or Word or Excel files, for example, across multiple countries. It's going to be not efficient at the end of the day. So I think the first thing that needs to be done is for companies that are globally active to decide internally what are the processes of the company, irrespective of the region. And then is how to disseminate that to the various regions, various countries, for example. And I think the only efficient way they can do that is through software tools. I don't think you can just distribute unbelievable amounts of spreadsheets and Word documents and expect different teams with different languages and different mindsets to work in that way. So when I will be talking about digitalization, it would, of course, be part of it would be data handling, but it's not so massively data that is collected from PV plants. But it's more about designing the processes and having a tool that is capturing all these processes from end to end. And there's a very long chain of things. And these processes are starting from the field engineer, goes to the back office, senior O&M engineer, then to the asset manager and senior asset manager to owner. So this is a very long chain. You cannot bring all these people work together on old-fashioned methods. You have to have an easy-to-use tool or easy-to-use tools, not just one, and have everyone working on the same platform, so to speak, which is predefined and describes exactly the way that people want to operate and work with each other. So, in other words, digitalization has to do to a certain extent of managing data, but I really do not believe that the solar industry is in need of big data handling the way that I understand that, at least. It's more about capturing, standardizing, making available information to all stakeholders. It's what software packages is mostly used nowadays. I mean, ERP is a very known term in all other industries. But if you talk about an ERP system in the solar industry, at least some years ago, people really didn't know what this acronym was in the first place. So we have a long way to capture to sort of align ourselves with other more mature industries, other in the renewables business, or generally speaking.
And I guess then that kind of really does link back to something that you said earlier about how the wind industry in particular is perhaps a bit more mature and a bit more au fait with some of these technologies. I guess just to finish up then, is there anything, or what would be the number one thing that the solar industry could perhaps learn from other renewables industries when it comes to this?
I think standardization is the key. Something that we've been talking for years now, also myself, while I was more active in the Solar Power Europe Association as well. Standardization is the key. It's not software is not the target by itself. So it's meaningless to have software just for the sense of having software, for the sake of having software. I think standardization is the key, because in the operations lifetime of an asset, most of it is repetitive things that we do. And I think it's easy to understand for anyone that if you have repetitive things you're doing, if you standardize these, then you save a lot of time. So I think the key for bringing down soft costs, to bring us back to the initial discussion, is to focus on standardization inside a company and between companies, because there are different stakeholders managing the asset. If we make this step, then all the rest is gonna come sort of automatically. So if you standardize the process, you will need the tool that will help you implement what you're dreaming about. So I think for me, the key right now is to have a very serious discussion about standardization in an industry. It's not something that is started now, but it's a long discussion in any case. And once we get to that stage, I think things are going to go significantly better. And I think that's, without being an expert in wind, I think that's one thing that wind is different from solar. Being an older, more mature industry, I think they've gotten to that stage much earlier than the solar industry has done.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for all of your insight this afternoon, Vassilis. It's been really, really invaluable. And thank you very much for your time.
Thanks very much, Liam, for your time as well. It's been a pleasure.